Okay, that's showing. Yeah, this. I wasn't originally scheduled to speak at Node Interactive, and so I decided to title this "How to Prepare a Talk at the Very Last Minute." I think this is pretty critical skills for these kind of last-minute engagements. I'm joking, of course. I did want to provide a little disclaimer that I didn't create any of the pictures in this presentation. I do guarantee that I personally searched for all of them on Google, and that's how I filled up most of these slides. One of the things I wanted to ask was, can I get a show of hands of people who are kind of engineers coding every day? Almost everybody. Okay, and who among you are either those engineers or also kind of in charge of making technical decisions or providing leadership in your companies? A pretty good mix. Okay. So really this talk is about how to grow the Node story at your company. Node has kind of sold itself. We have these conferences for a reason. There's a lot of excitement around it. But the reality of bringing Node into especially larger, mid-sized to larger enterprises has a lot of complexities and also often doesn't communicate up the stack to or up the chain to your leaders, your VPs, C-level executives, and so forth. So this is a lot about having kind of a plan going into this and how you kind of expect to grow. And just a little bit about me. I'm Trevor Livingston. I'm a former Node platform lead at PayPal. I was part of the Kraken.js team there. And currently, as it was just mentioned, I'm now principal architect at HomeAway. And really, I kind of came over to help with the beginning of the Node journey. But to give you a little bit more context to that is at PayPal, we had a very large Node success story. PayPal was founded in 1998. It was originally a C++ shop. It has since grown into kind of when I started, a Java shop as well, as they moved a lot of their front tier, web tier level things to Java and Spring. They are about a 15,000 person large company now, very big. And the Kraken team came in to bring Node to PayPal, and really that was about building new experiences and being able to innovate very quickly and go to live faster and provide better experiences to our customers. Really, we have over 800 Node engineers, not just engineers. We have probably 3,000 engineers, or had now that I'm not there, but 800 Node developers, over 100 applications in live, about 1,500 internal Node modules that were developed by internal developers, and 400 million requests a day. So really, how do you get there, right? There's no recipe for that, especially back then. We really learned as we went, and we actually had a lot of help. And Node has a great community. Definitely use it. There are many out there that have already encountered issues that you're going to encounter as you begin to scale development, and they can help. But really, how you think about growing this project within a company is really going to help in laying out a plan. And what I really want to talk about is that plan for growth. You're getting into a new technology, but technology is really supposed to solve problems, and replatforming onto one of these new technologies has a cost. It can be very, very expensive, and it really had better have a benefit. So you have to ask yourself, why am I doing this? These kind of stories need specific outcomes. And you need to understand what kind of problem you're solving, whether that's a problem of productivity, if you want your developers to be able to iterate faster, if you want to think about things like running on commodity hardware and scaling more cheaply. Understand the problems you're solving going into this, because this is going to really help you not only plan for the future, but be able to communicate that to people making decisions regarding the financial side of this. And really that kind of becomes a focus on adding value. How does Node and moving to Node align with not only your own goals as a technologist, but the business goals. How does that align with what the company is trying to do or where the company is trying to go? And really, how are you adding value to the customer? Node usually lends itself to web application development, and really, what is that? How is that helping your your customers that are interacting? And then how is it helping the business? And really, to get there, this becomes really about demonstrating success on a small scale. It's a small win, and focusing on a single success story to really, and that's really kind of getting back to how we got Node in the door at PayPal. It's all about that pilot application, that experiment that is going to basically yield results that allow you to learn from it. And really think of it as a learning exercise. This is about being able to recognize, what benefits it's adding, how the developers interacting with it are experiencing it, and really what kind of value it's adding. And kind of speaking to that, think about build, measure, learn. This is about tracking your successes and your failures. You want to understand, and ultimately accepting failure. But you really want to be able to identify your gaps through those failures. So being able to have this very specifically carved out and very isolated piece that you can go and experiment with, iterate on a small team, and then learn from it and identify gaps that you can go take out to reproduce across teams is going to be very important. And I'll be kind of revisiting anti-patterns over the course of this presentation. But the anti-pattern when introducing Node as a new technology is going to be thinking in terms of migration. There will be a temptation among developers especially and teams that have existing products and are moving to a new product to think of this in terms of like, how do I take this Java class and transform it into a JavaScript class? How do I take this JSP and convert it into React or Angular or what have you? And really, when you go back to thinking about that small initial success, it's also about creating isolation and building new. Creating isolation for a team that you can reduce churn that's happening on the day-to-day of the business and really focus in on that single experiment. The other part of this is from team to teams. Node that's the easy part, that's the fun part. Everybody wants to play with Node, everybody wants to write JavaScript. But really the people aspect of this becomes very challenging. When you're doing Node by yourself as an individual contributor, that's like, you're having fun at night and hacking away. When everybody else starts doing it, it's more challenging. It becomes a kind of it's not quite as easy to make decisions. It's not as easy to be agile. And I don't mean process-wise, but just be able to be flexible. So really, how do you start thinking about scaling development when you go from that initial team with that initial pilot success and you start growing it across different teams? Consistency will be a really big part of that. So I'm a big fan of kind of Wild West development. I like a lot of flexibility. I think that's really important for innovation. But constraints are very necessary on creating reproducible development success. And a lot of that consistency will come from the design choices you make. It will have to do with things like being more configuration-based, being able to inject configuration, providing frameworks that make it easier for people to develop on, and not just purely using open source, but providing some sort of baseline for how people are going to be developing applications that run within your proprietary ecosystem. So if that's a private data center, if it's AWS or what have you. The other really important factor for teams is education, and this it's actually surprisingly hard to find a picture about education that's not really boring. But this actually also has a point because I think this panda is educating this knight about going over that hill or whatever it is. And this is actually kind of it is relevant. It is a little bit important because. You want to ensure that engineers are trained initially, and you want to mentor going forward. But really, education is going to become a key aspect of your overall success in building these things. You're going to get a lot of knights that are coming over the hill. You're going to have to blast them with rainbows and educate them. But I'll get a little bit more into that in a second. The other aspect of building great interconnected teams is really focusing on that engagement and bringing not only the teams together, but sharing the experience and really developing in the open and making everybody a part of kind of the ongoing knowledge building. So not having this concept of a team that is building everything and kind of handing it over to product teams that are going to pick it up and use it, but having those product teams really engage. There are tools for this. Slack has, obviously one of them is hugely successful. Things like GitHub, making sure that you are not doing things privately, but really focusing on engaging everybody and building a community around that engagement and getting feedback early. It is very important on making sure that as these teams grow and you go from a few developers to hundreds of developers potentially, that those developers aren't completely lost and they're not just in a kind of a waiting to be told from a central team, but have that knowledge disseminated. And the anti-pattern here is going to be turnkey solutions. So there'll typically be a temptation to wrap everything up in a nice little box and ship it off. And when you see things like these kind of turnkey frameworks, something like Electrode, which recently came out, comes to mind, is it puts you in an ecosystem and it really marries you to it. And the problem with that is that it's really stifles innovation and flexibility and being able to move to something new that comes out. Building tooling internally and being able to create consistency for teams is really about capabilities and not rails. Providing these capabilities allows people to pick and choose, override when necessary, and move to new technologies as they become available with a lot less effort. And kind of on this note, you have to kind of keep in mind that not only is flexibility important to innovation, but if you're building these turnkey solutions in the name of reducing the complexity, is that you can't really reduce complexity in a system. You can rearrange it, you can move it, but you can't reduce it. And if you put the flexibility in this turnkey solution, or I'm sorry, you put the complexity in the turnkey solution, then you're stuck with it there. So it's a very different world when people begin using what's been built, when people go live. You really get into this world of how do you operationalize things. You've built some prototypes. You've experimentally put it on AWS or what have you, and then you discover that it has performance problems, that the node process is crashing. How do you account for these things? The first thing I want to talk about is security. Has anybody ever seen this picture or something like it? This is Metal Gear Solid, and he's fighting a crab. I thought that was pretty cool. But security is going to be the number one concern for the business, and it really should be the number one concern for everybody who's shipping products to live. There's obviously a lot of things you need to think about. Web security, just kind of your internal connection security, but really one of the kind of things that I think is often missed is open source coverage. As we've moved towards kind of a very open source world, we have things like NPM, anybody can install anything. You really need to start thinking about security advisories that are on open source modules that are great tools for this, like NSP. I think there's SNCC, which was talked about earlier today, and others is sometimes baked into things like Sonatype or Artifactory. And understanding kind of the security issues of applications that are being used is going to be very important. But the other interesting thing is that it's not just about things like security advisories, which tend to be pretty obvious. It's about code, but also about licenses. And this is something that most developers just don't think about. And it's going to become very important for both doing things like inner source as well as open source, is to start thinking about licenses that you are using as well as that you are consuming for from the open. And kind of an example there is things like a GPL, which is not necessarily a safe license. So it becomes very important to actually interact both with like your security teams as well as legal to understand kind of the ramifications of products you're using. And once again, there are tools that can help with that. You can create restrictions, and that's kind of an important consideration to have. Performance. Really, you will learn to hate rendering on the server as well as SSL when you finally start noticing that basically all the time you're spending is either in SSL or rendering, and usually it's just the SSL encryption side of that. But what you will learn to love is APM solutions. So application performance monitoring, you see things like New Relic, App Dynamics, InSolid. Well, that's not really APM, but it tells you a lot about performance. These tools are going to be super important for understanding how your application is behaving and performing. And what's really most important is not thinking of this in the terms of, hey, I'm just looking at my production, but actually making that part of development culture. So really providing these tools internally as well, bringing performance, load and performance testing into the everyday for developers, and really doing that as a matter of course. That should just be what you're, when you sit down, you should be popping up in a dashboard and looking at the performance of your app in live. You should be, as you're developing new code, running performance tests. They should be hopefully automated. You should be able to track these things over time and understand how your performance is improving or degrading. And kind of the final item on the operational side, and which is very kind of a sticky problem, is availability in Node. And a lot of people don't like to think about this, but Node is, for all intents and purposes, single process. We know that when we have uncaught exceptions, the process crashes. But what happens when a process crashes and you're handling a request? Well, it's just going to hang for the user, and nothing's going to happen for them. And that's a failed customer interaction. Even when you use things like domains, you can return an error to the user, but at the end of the day, you have to crash, because just like this cat in this box, Node is like Schrodinger's cat. If an error occurs that is uncaught, you no longer know the state. And a lot of people have said this, but there seems to be a lot of disagreement about how to handle this within the scope of a request. But the fact is, you never know the state anymore once you have an uncaught exception. And ultimately, you have to crash. And it's something that you have to plan for. So you have to be also aware of how frameworks handle these errors. I'm a huge fan of Happy as a framework. I think it's amazing. By default, it has a domain handler and it doesn't crash, which makes it have a lot of uptime, but you no longer know the state of your application. So then you have to think about things like, how can I observe this application enough in real time to be able to pull it down on demand and work out other solutions around it. Really, at the end of the day, it's best to crash. How you recover from these errors is also really important. There are ways of handling availability patterns when you have things like gateway proxies, or if you're using Nginx for load balancing, you can load balance for Node and, for example, retry to other upstreams on crash. That will improve your availability overall. But the fact is these crashes are going to happen, whether it's things like out-of-memory exceptions or people doing null pointer exceptions. And in my experience, like 99% of all crashes are caused by people ignoring errors and callbacks and just saying, oh, well, there's a response here or what have you. The other thing I thought I'd mention is promises. When an error isn't handled in a promise, you basically get an uncaught exception, but it's actually just an unhandled rejection. But it's really the same thing. And so nothing will crash, but you no longer know the state of your application. And that can cause to other problems as well. And so the anti-pattern here is being single-minded about your approach. And what I mean by that is that Node isn't a silver bullet. And Node is going to solve potentially a lot of problems. It's going to improve productivity, may improve performance. But what else is slowing you down in development? You can't just say, hey, we're going to improve the iteration time of individual teams building these products, but it takes them a month to ship it to live, right? you're not really solving anything if you're not solving this holistically. So once you've kind of got the operational aspects worked out, and boy, am I over? I think I'm over. I'm gonna blaze through this now. I went way longer than I thought I would. I didn't even get to the pictures of my kids. So maintenance. Do I have another minute? Anybody? Can somebody tell me? Okay, well, I have to really talk fast. Okay. Okay, this is gonna blaze through. I thought I was gonna go way too fast. Now I went way too slow. Okay, design choices. The decisions you make today are gonna affect you tomorrow. You need to think about things like pure dependencies. Are you putting pure dependencies everywhere? Don't, because it's extremely painful. It's very hard to migrate away from. Globals, obviously, tread lightly. Really making assumptions about your upstreams. That's one way of shooting her in the face with this gun, is when you have things like express middleware and you are having expectations on upstreams, you no longer have decoupled software. You've just created this coupling, and really, why are you doing that in the first place? And really, I can't say this strongly enough, is if anybody's ever heard of continuation local storage, please don't use it. If you haven't heard of it, don't look it up. It sounds like magic, and it is. It's total magic. It's black magic, and it is the worst thing. And no offense to Forrest who wrote it. It's an amazing tool. It's just it makes things impossible to debug. It's a performance hit. It's a big problem. Please think about ownership. As you build things internally for reuse, you need to think about who owns these capabilities. Who are going to be continuing to maintain them in the future? Do you want to own all of them? Think about support. Focus on self-sufficiency. On that note, Antipattern, do not hold people's hands. People learn from failure. A failure is a very powerful learning tool, and it's very important to establish a culture early on that it's okay to fail, and that it's okay to not know what you're doing, and it's about educating. I'm just going to kind of skip over InnerSource, I think. I'm going to talk a little bit about discoverability on that. Think about discoverability. This is actually supposed to be a picture of a map, and actually I didn't Google image search this. This was drawn by my daughter, and that's her right there. And you can see she has a wistful look on her face. She just finished her ice cream, and she's kind of wondering what to do next. There's my son. I had to throw him the slides. I'm a dad. If anybody's a parent, they understand. A couple more notes on InnerSource is just, and I really wish I could spend more time on this, is that think about transparency. Think about giving management insight into what you're doing that is internally shared. Products tend to be driven by requirements that are tied to timelines, and if developers are not basically working on that alone, then usually management and product management is saying, what the hell is going on? But the thing is that individual developer may be contributing to code that is shared by multiple teams and is improving productivity for those teams. And so understanding how to provide that insight early on as you start doing InnerSource and start sharing code is really important. LTS for InnerSource. These are project ghost towns. People leave teams, people leave the company. You need a plan for this. We have over 1,500 modules or had at PayPal. I don't know how many of those are actively maintained, and that becomes a problem. But the anti-pattern to InnerSource's permission is going to happen. Plan for it. But provide good constraints. Don't provide controls. And that's it. I'm only 6 minutes over. Thank you.